This is the honey badger. Watch it run in slow motion. Look, it runs all over the place. Whoa, watch out, says that bird. Ew, it's got a snake. Oh, it's chasing a jackal. Oh my gosh. Oh, the honey badgers are just crazy. The honey badger has been referred to by the Guinness Book of World Records as the most fearless animal in all of the animal kingdom. Honey badger don't care.
All right. Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And here we are kicking off the new year in 2026 with a very special treat. I'm starting off the new year with some big name guests, and starting with my friend, Dr. Lydia McGrew, aka the Honey Badger of Christian apologists. So, hey, Lydia, how are you?
Hey Dale, not too bad. It's good to be here.
Awesome, awesome. Hopefully, just sort of curious, you've been on the show multiple times, but just for the audience sake, what have you been up to since the last time you were on the show? Is there anything special projects you're working on or
Um, I keep up my YouTube channel every week, and that takes a lot of my time because I try to put something out every week. I was just mentioning to Dale in the pre-show that I recorded a lot of hours of material with Fan Christopoulos recently, the last couple months, and so that took a lot of prep time. I hope that will be published. I'm writing an article, so some things like that.
Awesome. Awesome. All right, cool. Well, today is I think, a very important topic, especially as, some of my fans will know, the notorious scoundrel Apologia posted up sort of his videos dealing with his take on Gary and the minimal facts approach. And, Lydia and I have some disagreements on that front, but I think, look, at the end of the day, we're both Christians. We're on the same team, even if we're not always on the same page. And because of that, it's important to kind of listen to each other and consider each other's opinions. And that's why I wanted to invite Lydia on for this show to kind of assess what are the differences between a minimal facts approach versus a maximal facts approach. What are some of the pros and cons against it? And Lydia has given some very substantive, I think, objections on an epistemic level against a minimal facts in favor of the maximal one. So I think that deserves to be heard and that sort of thing. So, on that front, Lydia, I'll kind of turn it straight over to you. Um, just kind of want to ask you in general, what is as you see it, what is the minimal facts approach versus a maximal facts approach, or even a moderate facts approach, and what are the differences between them?
Right. So there's a reason why I place uh, the minimal facts approach together on one side of this with something like Dr. William Lane Craig's argument, which he's insistent is not minimal facts. I call them minimalist. So that's kind of an umbrella that I think covers both of them. Dale, I believe, may be the person who coined the phrase moderate facts approach for Dr. Craig's approach. But I see them both as being on one side of a pretty clearly distinguishable line from my own maximal data approach. So the two central differences, first of all, holistic reliability of the Gospels. That doesn't have to mean inerrancy, and I'm not an inerrantist, but it means that they are overall highly reliable. They're not changing facts or that kind of thing. Holistic reliability of the Gospels is not playing a crucial role in either the minimal facts or the core facts. Dr. Craig has used the term core facts approach to arguing for the resurrection. So that's not important to their argument. It is important to my argument. And then related to that, neither of them make use of what I've called the DT or disciples testimony proposition as at an important place in the argument, and that is that the disciples claimed that they had had the experiences in detail as recorded in the Gospels and Acts. So notice that's not circular because it says that this is what they claimed. Obviously, if I assume as a premise that the stuff recorded in the Gospels and Acts happened, then that entails that Jesus rose from the dead. I mean, it's like probability one because the Gospels and Acts claim that Jesus rose from the dead. Okay, but it's not like that. It's that they claimed that these detailed things happened. And neither of those approaches claims that. Interestingly, the DT proposition is simultaneously weaker and stronger than the core fact or minimal fact of the appearances. It's weaker in the sense that the core fact or minimal fact says that the disciples actually had experiences that they interpreted as being of the risen Jesus. Whereas all I'm saying is that they claimed to have had, but now we get to the way that it's stronger, which is that I use the proposition they claimed to have had these detailed experiences. Whereas the minimal or core fact is that they actually had, drumroll, some kind of experience that they interpreted to be experiences of the risen Jesus, sometimes adding in groups as well as individuals. That's sometimes part of that core fact. Okay, so it's simultaneously weaker and stronger. And those two differences are related because I use holistic reliability of the Gospels to argue that these are at least faithful representations of what the alleged witnesses claimed. Okay, and I get that from further arguments that I'm prepared to make for the holistic reliability of the Gospels. So it's a very different argumentative structure.
Okay, so I have some follow-ups. I want to take a look at the maximal facts, starting with that, because obviously you mentioned there are sort of two fundamental aspects that differentiate it from a minimal or a moderate facts approach. And I'll just admit, I wish I could take credit for the moderate facts, but it was actually Caleb Jackson who came up with that. So credit where credit is due. But okay, so this principle of DT, I have a couple questions with that. So the first one is, obviously minimal facts proponents, they'll say, well, look, you're going to encounter skeptics who are going to question this, that this isn't eyewitness testimony or the claims of the disciples and their testimony. How do you prove, or what evidence do you have to kind of warrant the DT principle?
Right. Well, that's ultimately going to be based on arguments for what I call a reportage view of the Gospels. And I characterize the reportage view as that the authors were close to the facts in the sense that it was not a telephone game, like Bart Ehrman says, with many, uh, many links before you get to the documents. So they're close to the facts, and they were trying to get it right. That is to say, they were never just inventing stuff. They were always at least trying to get it historically right when they presented as historical. And then thirdly, they were highly successful in doing so. So highly successful doesn't have to mean perfect, but that any errors that you do encounter, if you do encounter errors, will be the kind that could be well explained within the paradigm of factual errors that you could get from a source that was close to the facts and was very conscientious. But that doesn't automatically mean that you're infallible. So that's the reportage model. And let me clarify, if somebody is an inerrantist, he does not have to say, oh, then I can't take the reportage model because you just said something about errors. The reportage model includes both traditional inerrantists and non-inerrantists like myself. So it's a big tent. But anyway, so I have then evidence quite a lot that I've written up in books and videos and blog posts, a big cumulative case for that reportage model. And if that is true, that they are in that genre of reportage, then it's very improbable that the gospel resurrection accounts and the one appearance in Acts 1 as well are invented and similarly, or embellished by the author. They just put something in there, to further their argument. And similarly for the account of the early church and the persecution they encountered and so forth in Acts, that is, substantially what Luke actually believed happened. And the author of Acts had good reason to believe that that's what really happened.
All right, fair enough. So, all right, so I did want to focus in on the other things. So something that I've actually I think could be useful, especially for your approach, and I want to get your thoughts on it. It's an area in philosophy called the epistemology of testimony. I'm not sure. I'm assuming you're familiar with this, right? But there are different positions one takes. So, given that it is testimony, let's pretend that we get this and the reportage model is true, kind of thing. People will take a different position. So there's like a reductionist position, which says, look, I can't believe testimony unless there's independent, non-testimonial evidence for the truth of that testimony versus a non-reductionist thing. So I'm just kind of curious, do you think that the DT principle and your reportage model depends on a certain view on the epistemology of testimony? And what are your thoughts on those positions?
No, I don't think it distinguishes between those. I would identify myself as a reductionist, but that's because I'm a classical foundationalist. So ultimately, even non-testimonial stuff is going to, if we get all the way down to the bottom, the proposition that there's a red cup, here's my red cup. The proposition that there's a red cup in front of me can also be reduced in its ultimate foundation to propositions about sensory qualia, as they're called, and seemings. It seems to me that I remember calling this a cup. It seems to me that I remember being in touch with this and getting it out of the cupboard this morning and so forth. So that can be reduced as well. So it's not really, so yeah, testimony is going to be reducible to uh, even, it seems to me that this person said this to me. It seems to me that I was reading this in this book or whatever. So in that sense, it's reductionist, but testimony is not disfavored as compared with, say, propositions about the external world that are non-testimonial. Okay, so in that sense, you can be a reductionist without treating testimony as being especially problematic. Let's put it that way. So no, by the time we're talking about DT, by the time we're talking about the reportage model, we're so far above the foundations. We're assuming like that these documents exist and stuff like that, that other minds exist, that that's not going to distinguish between a reductionist and non-reductionist view of testimony.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's important because I did think that would be like a helpful contribution and stuff like that, just to understand kind of thing. Does it have an impact or not on your methodology? So yeah. All right. Well, at this point, let's kind of switch gears because the main reason I wanted to invite you on was looking at a minimal or moderate facts approach. You have raised certain epistemic problems, and I just kind of wanted to get your take. I think one of the main issues that you bring up, and believe it or not, it's one that kind of agree with. There's a reason I go for a moderate facts approach as opposed to the traditional minimal one, but I think you call it the specificity problem, and specifically, you've kind of indicated that the appearance minimal fact in both the minimal and the moderate approaches is really your chief concern. Do you kind of just want to outline what is this specificity problem with respect to the appearances, and why do you think it's such a problem?
Right. So the appearance fact or facts, plural, are very crucial for arguing for the bodily resurrection specifically, as opposed to some kind of exaltation of Jesus or a spiritual resurrection or, something like that, where he wasn't really raised in a body. Um, and there's a wide variation in what people mean by it. Now, in both the core facts and the minimal facts account, the idea is to define, or maybe not define, maybe I should say, but to state a proposition like this. This may not be the exact wording, but like this. Uh, the disciples had experiences as individuals and in at least one case as a group of what they took to be the risen Jesus, or had experiences in as individuals in at least one group that convinced them that Jesus had risen from the dead, something like that. They took to be experiences of the risen Jesus. But the problem is when you deliberately state it like that, then when you bring in critical scholars like quote unquote liberal scholars, they might or might not be Christians in some sense, but they are definitely not, conservative scholars. And you bring them in as sort of trophies and you hold them up and say, hey, even Gerhard Ludemann acknowledges this, even Dale Allison acknowledges this, etc. You start dropping names. This person is not, a conservative, but even he acknowledges this. There's going to be a variation in what is meant by that. Um, and it's epistemologically wrong. It's actually incorrect to deliberately use a bit more vague version of your proposition in order to appear to, favor your ultimate conclusion when you know that there's a relevant, more specific version of the proposition that is floating around in the area of the argument. So, if the critical scholar in question has a very definite or fairly definite belief about what we know or can't know or something like that about what those experiences were really like, then you're soft focusing in order to claim him as sort of a trophy or a prize, or even claim that a large majority of scholars agree on this, um, by erasing that difference in what he actually means. And so you can't you can't legitimately do that. That's essentially it's a fallacy of equivocation. And interestingly, though Dr. Craig wants to downplay this now, he has said definitely in his published works that a wide majority, he uses the word wide majority, of scholars agree with all of his central facts or core facts, including that appearance fact. And so it has to be stated in that vague way in order to say that, but then that's papering over some really important differences in what is meant.
Fair enough. Yeah. All right. Well, okay. So I have a few follow-ups then. So let me ask this. So first of all, let me kind of question why is it necessary for a minimal or maximal facts approach to necessarily argue for a bodily resurrection? Obviously people have different views, as you've said. Could it be enough for the goal to be, look, I can prove some kind of supernatural resurrection happened, and that's my goal, to purposefully leave the nature of it vague, but just to kind of argue for some kind of supernatural event that we call a resurrection. Why would that not be good enough?
Well, there's two things we need to distinguish. First of all, why should the ultimate conclusion that you're arguing for include a bodily resurrection on the one hand? And another thing that one could mean in that question would be, why isn't it enough as a premise, even for the bodily resurrection, to say, well, a lot of scholars grant that something weird happened or something unusual happened. So I'll take those in order. Okay, so the first of those would be, hey, why is it even important ultimately to argue for the bodily resurrection? Like, why do we even want to do that? Well, the first thing I'll say is people who use the minimal facts and the core facts approach are arguing ultimately. I mean, they themselves see that as their goal. They themselves promote it as an argument for Christianity. And Christianity includes the bodily resurrection and always has as a core creedal position. Now, you could say, well, let's just abandon that. Let's just say, someone could say, okay, that's not important to me, right? Um, so this came up with Philip Goff, you may remember, the philosopher, and Cameron Bertuzzi announced and was criticized for having a clickbaity title on his channel. Hey, Philip Goff, you know, converts to Christianity on our channel, right? And then it turned out that Goff means he uses the word physical, but he means that Jesus could have arisen as some form of energy, so like Jesus could have been a single photon or something after he rose from the dead. And he's quite definite that Jesus did not arise in a bodily form that could be touched and so forth and so on. And I think it was correct to say, hey, that's an important difference. And there's a reason why Christianity has always treated that as important. And that gets us into theology, our own resurrection, and having real resurrection bodies and matter and the importance of matter in creation, etc. Okay. So that's I can say a lot about why we should care. Okay. But from an epistemological point of view, most fundamentally, and I know that the people who make this argument do take themselves to be ultimately, out on the far end, arguing for the bodily resurrection. So, as an epistemologist, my question is, do they have a strong enough argument for what they are claiming they have ultimately an argument for? Okay, so that takes us to the next question, which is epistemologically, is it good enough for them to say, well, at least we've got, maybe scholarly consensus or at least some, prominent names of non-conservatives who acknowledge that something weird happened, something impressive happened. Is that going to be enough? Which the disciples took to be experiences of the risen Jesus. Is that going to be enough ultimately to let them argue for a bodily resurrection? And that's where I believe I can say, no, it's going to be, given the structure of their argument, that's going to be too weak. So if you care about the bodily resurrection, and if you care about having a strong argument for the bodily resurrection, then that's not the way to go. Maximal data is a way to go. And then you can decide for yourself if you care about that. So then do you do you want me to say more about why that's not a strong argument, in my
Yeah,
opinion?
yeah,
Okay.
go for it.
Okay. So I'm going to give an example here. There's a principle in probability theory and epistemology that you must always use the most specific, uh, relevant description of the evidence in your argument. So here's an example I'm going to give. Let's suppose that there's a number in a box and the box is closed, and I look into the box and it looks to me like the number is 5. And I close the box and I go away. And so then I'm wanting to argue that the number in the box is 5. Now, let's suppose that we were given ahead of time that that was going to be any number from 1 to 100. So our prior probability then that it was 5 is 1 out of 100. All right. Um, so then other people come along, all right, and they each look in the box and close it and come out and say what they think the argument was. And let's say I get this whole scattershot set of reports. Maybe one other person says it's 5. He agrees. And then someone else says it's 95. And then another person says it's, 10. Okay, so etc. If I group them, I can, let's say, group them, and I can get a majority of them saying a number, giving a number. They've each given a specific number. None of them have made a mere greater than or less than statement. And if I take them in a chunk, I can get a group, all of which have said a number less than 20. So then I say, hey, everybody, look at how this survey of people looking in the box favors my conclusion that the number is 5 because a majority agree that it's less than 20. And we started off with a probability of 1 in 100, but on the proposition that the majority, or, that it's less than 20, then that would give it a higher probability, 1 in 20, right? Or 1 in 19 or something like that. That's illicit because I know that a bunch of these people made specific claims that are literally incompatible with the proposition that it's 5. The guy who said it's 10, if his evidence is evidence at all, it's evidence against the proposition that it's 5. It's not evidence for the proposition that it's 5. And that's where this principle comes in, that you can't just deliberately pick your level of soft focus to make the evidence look like it favors your conclusion. Now, I believe that something like that is going on here. So take a group appearance. All right. Take Dale Allison as an example. Allison is very clear that the strongest, most robust aspects of the group appearance experiences. And here I'm thinking of Jesus eats with the disciples as a group. Jesus invites Thomas to touch him and so forth. That and says to them, see that I have flesh and bones and a ghost does not have these and so forth. Those were later embellishments. And so Allison has this feedback loop going back and forth between his ultimate thesis, which is that they had some kind of vision, not a robustly bodily experience, and the actual nature of their phenomenological nature of their experience, where the phenomenological nature of their experience is such as would be best explained by a vision. Okay. So that their original experience did not include, it did not include those super robust things. Those were later apologetic additions. And he's got it all, worked out in various ways. Maybe private individuals had what seemed more robust experiences, but he thinks that can be accounted for by grief apparitions. That sometimes in grief apparitions, private individual, certain individual, when he's alone, feels like he's able to touch the person. But he's sort of snipping it up and dividing it up, and then what they experienced as a group was a thing, but it was a thing that was not like what we find in the Gospels. And so that's similar to the person looking in the box and saying, closing it, saying the number is 10. And then I'm trying to count that person as if he favors my conclusion because, hey, at least he said it was something less than 20. All right. You're deliberately erasing the differences to claim that that person's testimony is on the side of your desired conclusion, and that's not legitimate. And it's the same way here. It's not recognized enough that there are kinds of experiences the disciples could have that would be evidence against bodily resurrection. That's, boy, people who are minimal facts advocates and moderate facts advocates, they just assume, we're getting closer to our goal if we admit that something weird happened. No, not necessarily. There are weird kinds of things that could happen. And if those were the only kinds of things that happened, they would be evidence against. So let's suppose that what really happened, total evidence, was that Jesus appeared only briefly to them as a group. He was visible, let's say, and audible, or visible and audible experiences, but nobody touched him when they were in a group, and they knew that nobody touched him when they were in a group. Maybe his feet were a couple inches off the ground. I'm not saying Allison doesn't say his feet were a couple inches off the ground, but I'm just spinning out an example. All right, and he came and he spoke a few words of comfort, and they felt like he seemed really triumphant. That's another thing that Allison will talk about, this sensation that the person seemed triumphant. And then he was gone. And that was all that happened. And they definitely did not have the experiences like in the Gospels. Well, that total evidence set would be evidence for some kind of visionary experience, and visionary nature, let's say, of Jesus, and therefore against his being raised in a really robust body. Because if he was raised in a really robust body, you would expect that he would give really robust evidence for it, which is like what we find in the Gospels. So it's interesting that you can end up treating what's actually evidence against it as if it's evidence for it if you allow yourself to take this soft focus.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay, just before I get to my main follow-up, but you mentioned Dale Allison, and
Mhm.
he's actually going to be coming on my show in a
Mhm.
couple of weeks to give
Mhm.
his view on the resurrection. But I'm just kind of curious because I know I always said that yeah, he does believe in spiritual resurrection and that sort of thing. But in recent times, he does seem to be sort of modifying where he'll say, I believe in a physical resurrection and stuff like that. So from my understanding, I'm kind of curious, what is your take on Dale's most recent view? Sorry, not yeah, Dale's most recent view. Is he kind of like I saw Dale Martin arguing from Yale University, arguing with Mike Lacona, and they had this view of the spiritual body as like it's not the same physical body, but it's transformed into almost the spiritual like substance. So it's almost a weird physical thing notion that they have in mind. Do you think Dale has that in mind, or is he thinking of something like an ethereal ghost? Like, what do you view Dale Allison's view of the resurrection as?
Yeah, I don't think his view has changed. I don't think Dale's view has changed in 20 years at all. He just sometimes expresses it in different ways. He did an interview recently. I think it was with O'Connor. Is that right?
The
Um,
cosmic skeptic, or
yes,
yeah,
yes,
yeah,
I think that's who it was. And he was pretty clear there that Jesus was not, there in the sense of being localized, in the sense that he had. So, for example, he says he sloughed off his physical body at a certain point because he didn't need it anymore. Now, he attributes that view to Martin Luther. And as an interpretation of Martin Luther, I strongly disagree. And I think every Orthodox Lutheran out there is howling at this point, and he's using some documents that came up with Luther in a debate over the nature of the sacrament, the nature of the Eucharist. Okay, and Luther's view that Jesus' body is in, with, and under the Eucharist. But I think that just creates confusion. Luther was very definite that, Thomas touched Jesus, Jesus invited them to touch him and so forth. We have that in his sermons. But the more important point is that Dale was characterizing this as his own view and then saying he agreed with Luther. So aside from Luther exegesis, that Jesus sloughed off his physical body because he didn't need it. So that's very definite. I think he he does not think that Jesus had a body that could be photographed, for example, after he rose again, that could be interacted with, in normal, tangible and visual ways. So, and a way to think of this is suppose someone else had happened to walk into the upper room while while Jesus was appearing to his disciples, and this person's like an unbeliever, you know? Um, would this person see what they're seeing? Well, that's like totally up in the air, and the answer is probably no. I take it on Allison's view. So, and he's also very definite that Jesus didn't have any organs that he didn't need. So, in that interview, he says, presumably he doesn't need to breathe. He says, so in other words, because Jesus is immortal, he takes that to entail that he's not normally physical. So if you don't need to breathe, why do you have lungs? If you don't need to eat, why would you have digestive organs, etc.? Okay. So he's really, it's a kind of a strong thesis that, for example, if Jesus doesn't need to eat, then he doesn't have the equipment that makes it possible for him to eat. Well, I mean, that doesn't follow. I mean, there are counterexamples to that, you know, all the time, that we have things that we don't need. We have physical aspects to our body that maybe are never called into play. Maybe the ability to recover from a particular disease or something, but we never are exposed to that disease. So Jesus certainly could have digestive equipment that allowed him to eat, even if he could, in fact, survive forever without eating. I think that's perfectly conceivable and reasonable, and I think that's even how it was. But Allison's position that he articulates in that recent interview is pretty clearly that Jesus didn't have anything that he didn't need. And that's why he didn't have a normal physical body, normal in the sense of being normally perceivable and interacting normally and eating fish and so forth.
Okay, just to kind of generalize then. So taking Dale Allison out of it, I'm just kind of curious. So I know that some scholars on the liberal end have kind of said, well, look, there is this transformation. So for lack of a better word, let's say the body transforms from ordinary physical matter to some other type of physical matter kind of thing. Would that be good enough to qualify under the bodily resurrection, or does there have to be that continuity? Like, look, the same physical body, yes, it's transformed in some respects, like Jesus can walk through walls, but in every sense that we say it's physical or bodily, that's the same. There's that continuity. What dies is what raises. Or do you think it can be transformed from one type of matter to some other type of matter, whatever that would be, like a spiritual matter?
Well, I think a problem here is that we really have no idea what they're talking about. What is this other kind of matter? Um, to me, the more important question, rather than using a phrase like type of matter, like, okay, what is a type of matter? What is a same type of matter? What is a different type of matter? We're not going down to the atomic level here necessarily. The more important question for, let's say, what I would call the orthodox bodily resurrection view is something like, is it tangible? Is it capable of interacting with what we might call ordinary matter? Is it perceptible in normal ways? And is it capable of eating, for example? Capable of eating, not necessarily that it has to eat. Okay, so Jesus' body can be transformed. It obviously is that he's immortal. I think Paul says he dies no more. Being risen from the dead, dies no more. Death hath no more dominion. Okay, fine. but it's matter in a sense that we could recognize. Not let's be clear. At the time the Gospels were written, nobody knew about carbon atoms per se. Okay. But that's not the point. When they believed that Jesus had a body, what they were asserting, and what Christians have always asserted, is that he had a body that can interact with matter and that is material in that robust accessibility kind of sense, and that is capable of doing various things like, knocking on wood, leaving footprints, eating, and so forth, and that they can have as a concept even if they've never heard of carbon. So that would be my answer to that.
Yeah, yeah. I tend to agree fully with you on that front. This isn't about my views, but I just think it's really important. Like the whole point is redeeming the creation that's been contaminated by sin. So,
Yeah.
you need to redeem our physical bodies. This is all good the way it is right now, being brought back to the original design plan and even better. So, all right, all right. So now here's something I want to ask you about. Now, so your main objection here, I take your point about what you're saying, but I think the problem you raised about, the box and the numbers and that sort of thing, that issue is Christian apologists will appeal to a two-step process, right? So this is what I do, for example. I will try to argue for the supernatural nature of the appearances, right? And now I agree with you that the minimal fact I don't think gets us there. Just saying, well, they had appearance experiences and just leaving it unspecified, that's not enough. That's why I give my moderate facts that I use is I think we need to prove certain facts about the nature of the appearances. So here are my things. I try to prove that they saw Jesus up close. He wasn't far away or something. That could be an illusion. He was recognizable as Jesus, the same continuity, same Jesus he was before, and he was in a mundane fashion. He wasn't in a glorious form. He wasn't shining or, floating in the sky, white, stuff like that. And
Mhm.
that I think that those features alone are enough for me to make an argument that this appearance experience was supernatural. And then there's a two-step process. Well, how do you get to the bodily part? And this is where you're familiar with it, right? A lot of apologists will say, well, now we can argue with Dale Allison and all the other scholars who would disagree with us that, well, Paul teaches us there is this bodily resurrection. That's clear. And by inference, we can extend that to what the original 12 disciples claimed they saw, stuff like that. So why couldn't a two-step process like this avoid your problem here of with the box and stuff like that?
hmm Well, so the first thing I need to stress is that if you're doing that two-step process as an alternative to the max data, um, your first step then is going to be saying that someone like, I mean, we're using Allison kind of as our foil, but there could be other people, who's not let's just say not a conservative, agrees with the first step, right? So your first step um, is going to be trying to state something that that person actually agrees with. And so right away, we've got this sort of ambiguity that's built right in, right? Because remember, Allison, I believe it's just a really interesting challenge to all non-maximal approaches. And he brings all this stuff where he claims that bereavement apparitions do sometimes appear mundane. So to take an example, and I'm not sure he's right about this, by the way. I think he's very uncritical about the apparition literature. I think he has a double standard. He's much more critical about the Gospels than he is about the apparition literature. Like he never considers that these people might have just been lying, or if he considers it, he kind of dismisses it, even when they weren't facing persecution like the disciples were claiming. So I'll just say that and then move on. But you could have an example where people say somebody visually kind of gave a solid impression. All right. And he claims that that's part of the apparition literature, that even if they didn't touch the guy, when they looked at him, he kind of looked like he was solid, like we would seem visually to perceive a person as solid. So then he's going to agree with your mundane and sufficiently, up close and recognizable features, right? But he's also going to be quite definite that those groups were not touching him and he was not eating and so forth, because he definitely thinks those were added. Now, what happens with the Apostle Paul and bringing in Paul then is that you're starting to, what you're really trying to get at is the disciples believed he was bodily. They believed he was physical. And sometimes a link there, which I'm assuming you use, would be Paul saying, they gave me the right hand of fellowship because they recognized that we were both preaching the same gospel. And, it's interesting. I've actually seen Mike Licona in an interview. I don't have the link right here, but he'll say something like, well, maybe with the minimal facts, you can't get bodily, but I think you can get bodily from Paul. So that was it. And he stated it kind of briefly, but, look, and he started, if I recall correctly, he started rattling off verses in Paul's epistles that seem to indicate that Paul thinks the resurrection, ours as well as Jesus's, is bodily. This runs into something that I call the bottleneck problem. And this is really, really important. So let's take a conditional probability. The probability of bodily resurrection, you can call that, BR or something like that, given that the disciples believed BR, okay, can be no higher than the probability of BR taking the disciples believed BR as probability 1. That's an upper bound. All right, that conditional probability. If you take the posterior of the thing you're interested in, BR, and you use the word given, okay, given means given it at probability 1. Now, let's suppose that you're non-traditional Christian, or you're skeptic or whatever, somebody who's just not a traditional Christian in some way, is going to grant that the disciples believed BR. Suppose that person says, yeah, they believed it. But then he has some story about how it came about, and Paul believed it. And then he has some story about how it came about that they believed it, but it wasn't true. All right. Or he thinks they believed it even though they didn't really have very strong evidence for it. I'm trying to remember which skeptic I was watching recently. I think it was Camille Gregor, if I recall correctly, as part of my prep for that material I recorded with Fan that I was mentioning earlier, where he said, I think they believed it, but they believed it for bad reasons. And he just came right out and said that. Now, Allison is a little more suave than that. But he still has pretty much a just so story where the disciples did believe that Jesus was bodily raised, but that was because of a kind of a combination of their Jewish views, because Jews thought in terms of bodily resurrection, Jesus' prediction that he would be raised, finding the tomb empty, because he's a little iffy on it, but he leans toward the idea that the tomb was empty, so that kind of got them thinking in terms of bodily resurrection. Their unfamiliarity with the apparition literature, and that, they didn't realize that someone could visually sort of appear visually solid, even though he isn't. If you went over tried to touch him, he wouldn't really be there. They didn't know that. They were kind of ignorant about that. So he's putting all of these things together. And that he seemed triumphant to them. And triumphant is a big deal for Allison, that he did not seem to be a defeated victim of death. And so if he was not bodily there in their theology, he would be a defeated victim. And so since to them, when they had some kind of experience, whether as an individual or as a group, Jesus seemed triumphant. And by the way, Allison claims he had an apparition experience of a friend and she seemed triumphant. Okay, so whatever it means to seem triumphant, but you fill that in how you like. But okay, that if Jesus seemed triumphant, then they just jumped to the conclusion that he was bodily, even if in a different sense, we might say he was a ghost. I mean, Allison doesn't like the word ghost, but an apparition. Now, my husband, Tim, I love this phrase. He coined the phrase Casper Invictus for Allison's view. So Casper is a ghost. Invictus means unconquered. Okay, so that Allison's view is the Casper Invictus view, the unconquered ghost. So what is common to all of these things? That the disciples believed it, but that they were not fully rational in believing it. They did not have rigorous, strong evidence for it, such as could convince a skeptic or should convince a skeptic. But they weren't skeptics. They were already half expecting that Jesus would rise again. They already had these theological ideas about resurrection, what that would mean, etc. And so then they were convinced by experiences that, if a modern skeptic had them, really should not be sufficient. So that's the problem, okay? Because at that point, you pile on more and more and more evidence. Well, look at this verse from Paul. Look at this verse from Paul. I've seen Dr. Lacona. He'll go out as far as the church fathers. I think he quoted Polycarp, if I recall correctly. Or it might have been maybe it was Ignatius. Anyway, the church fathers, and they believed in the bodily resurrection. And then he'll make this connection between the various church fathers and John, or this church father and Paul, etc. Some sort of a line of custody there. And okay, if that church father believed it, then probably Paul believed it. And if Paul believed it, then probably the disciples believed it. And he thinks he's increasing the probability of actual bodily resurrection, as if we can just keep increasing. Okay, fine. You maximalists don't think we've got a strong enough argument for bodily resurrection. Watch this. Here's another church father that believed that resurrection was bodily. Here's another verse from Paul that shows he believed that resurrection was bodily. And I'm like, I'm sorry, when it finally gets to the end, it's like traffic all being funneled into a single lane by construction on the highway or whatever. All that's doing is raising, at the best, the probability that the disciples believed that Jesus rose bodily, and you can get that closer and closer to probability 1 with diminishing returns, by the way. But what's the upper bound on that? Suppose it has probability 1. Yes, let's call it certain that the disciples believed that Jesus was risen bodily. Okay, but why did they believe it? Did they believe it for sufficient reason or insufficient reason? So I'm going to give, real quickly, I'm going to give an example that I've given elsewhere. Suppose you had a neighbor and were talking to her, and she said, my dead husband appeared to me. Okay, and my dead husband he rose from the dead. He rose from the dead. You're like, whoa, what? And she says, yeah, I saw him. I saw him. He rose from the dead. And you get interrupted, all right, before you can ask more questions and get more information about what she actually experienced. And then she moves away. And you never get the opportunity to get, blow by blow. Okay, why do you think this? So that you can evaluate for yourself why she thinks this. Now, suppose you're absolutely convinced of her sincerity. You've known her for a long time. You're convinced that she actually believed it. Well, give that probability 1. The neighbor believes that her husband rose from the dead. But you cannot get behind that because you lose contact with her to find out why. Now, do you then believe that her husband rose from the dead? I mean, that's a pretty hard sell. You want to, understandably, because the resurrection should have somewhat low probability. We're not all just credulous here. Like, yeah, why not? Her husband rose from the dead. No, you should have a low probability for that. And that knowledge of her sincerity all by itself is not going to overcome that. You want more details about why she believed it. And that's the problem here, that these more quote unquote liberal scholars, they think the details were such that probably if they were being really rigorous, the disciples should not have believed this, but they did. And so that's why you can't do it in exactly that staged way that you were describing.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. And I do have to admit that in the minimal facts apologists and stuff and scholars, I do think they really focus on, okay, part of the two-step process for the second step, they really go, well, we can prove they believed it, and they kind of leave it at that. And I think you're entirely correct that more is, okay, is it reliable though? They believed it, and are they warranted in that belief or not, kind of thing. So, but one thing I want to say with this is, and I actually have a way to prove that on my own, I think, kind of thing. But I'm just kind of curious, do you think that the minimal fact, instead of abandoning the minimal facts for this reason, this bottleneck problem, why couldn't you just, okay, the minimal facts people say, okay, fine, let's work on another argument to establish that their beliefs are warranted for one reason or another. And I'll just give you my own thing just to see what you take. Hopefully you don't mind me raising it. But I agree with you that not just resurrection, but bodily resurrection is an essential of the Christian faith. And on that basis, I have this argument based on God not allowing for undue confusion. He cannot allow the disciples to believe in an essential doctrine, such as the bodily resurrection, for bad reasons, or if it's false or something. In one way or another, God would guarantee, so to speak, from a warrant perspective, that we are warranted in that belief. So, I'm just kind of curious, twofold there. Do you think we could save the minimal facts if we just add some kind of argument for the warrantedness of the belief? And what's your thoughts on my way of doing that?
Okay, that's an interesting question. My first answer to that would be, let's go back to what I defined as the difference between the max data and other approaches. So this is to your first question. Could we, supplement it in some way? I believe that the only way to supplement it and make it a really strong argument is to make it maximalist, and to argue for DT. And that the only really strong way to argue for DT is to use holistic gospel reliability, that they weren't just the kinds of authors making stuff up and adding them for theological reasons and so forth. So that would be my first answer, that if you supplement it in the way that I think you need to supplement it, now you're doing maximalism, and you should admit that. You shouldn't say, well, I'm not doing maximalism, I'm doing this other thing, but it's just sort of enhanced minimalism or something. That would then be confusing, and not, in a sense, not giving due credit to maximalism. Like, oh, as it happens, I was forced to do maximalism after all. All right, but now to your specific version. I see multiple problems with that. One problem is that a skeptic does not believe in the existence of an omnibenevolent God. Okay, he's you know, even if he's a theist or a deist or something, that doesn't mean that he believes that God has all the properties associated with traditional theism, and in particular omnibenevolence, which is what you're relying on there. In fact, I would say that the argument goes the other way. The resurrection is one of our strongest arguments for omnibenevolence, because Jesus teaches that he is, the representative of God, a God who is good, who loves us, who etc., right? Who wants to save us from our sins, who wants to give us eternal life. And now this is all Jesus teaching. And then Jesus commissions his disciples, and in Acts commissions the Apostle Paul. So now we've got Pauline theology, etc. And that's routed through to some extent the resurrection. So whereas you're taking it that we know omnibenevolence over here in some completely independent way, and then we can apply that to say God wouldn't have let like God exists, an omnibenevolent God exists, and he wouldn't let the disciples believe this on insufficient grounds. Good luck with that. Because I really think to have a high posterior of an omnibenevolent God it sure helps to have a strong independent argument for the resurrection. So once you're entangling those in the other way, in the other direction, like you've got to assume omnibenevolence in order to have a strong argument for the resurrection. Now you've just kind of deprived yourself of that independent argument for omnibenevolence on pain of circularity. Uh, but also, you know, there's a reason why people talk about the evidential problem of evil. We know that if God exists, even if an omnibenevolent God exists, he allows a lot of horrible, horrible things. We know that already. That's a given. That's a datum of our existence. Whoever God is, taking him to exist, taking him to be omnibenevolent, somehow that is compatible with his allowing human trafficking. That is compatible with his allowing children to be raped and murdered because those things happen. We know that they do happen. Okay. And so, in the grand scheme of things, and also, God allows really good people to believe really wacky things. Okay. God has allowed cults to arise. How do we know that? Because cults have arisen. All right. So if theism is true, you know, it's got to be compatible with very sincere people who appear to want to know the theological truth. I mean, I think Mormonism is badly false. Now, I've offended all your Mormon listeners, but God allows Mormonism to exist. Okay. God allowed the followers of Joseph Smith to believe Joseph Smith. God allows Islam to exist. He allows various religions to exist that are incompatible with one another and that are even badly wrong, and allows people to go, because some of them have to be badly wrong, because they can't all be true, and even allows people to go all through their entire life and die in false religious beliefs. So I I don't think your argument has much purchase because it is essentially an a priori argument from the character of God. And not only is your skeptical interlocutor not going to already agree to that character of God, but even if he did, it would be very easy to point out all kinds of terrible things that God apparently allows and I believe there's an answer to that evidential problem of evil myself, but I believe that answer actually comes through Christianity, not the other way around. And it comes through Christian teachings about like the afterlife, for example. The sufferings of this present life are not worthy to be compared, and various things of that kind. But you gotta have Christianity in order to rely on those answers. So that I don't really think that attempt to supplement is very good.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think I definitely agree with the first part. I think I would have responses to the second part, but you're right. Like the whole point of a minimal facts is if I want to get to bodily resurrection, and you're granting things for the sake of the skeptic, you're gonna have to get him to grant this whole thing about God and stuff like that. So yeah, that was a good point there. So all right. So I want to switch gears a bit and ask you, look, so obviously the whole point of the minimal facts is that, well, look, we can grant the gospels are unreliable in certain respects, but this is not a problem because we appeal to the criteria of authenticity. And these are the tools that allow secular historians to kind of dig into even an unreliable text and pick out, okay, this bit's historical, this bit's historical. I'm just kind of curious, do you think that the criteria of authenticity are these good tools that kind of take care of this issue of gospel unreliability that, we don't need to prove the reliability of it?
I don't think so. In this case, in fact, in general, I don't think so. It's not to say that you could never use something that is taken to be a criterion of authenticity, criterion of embarrassment, or whatever it might be. Um, but all that is going to mean is that something is, let's say, especially unlikely to be made up. And I like that phrase, especially unlikely. Um, and that can contribute to a case for reliability. If you've got things in there. I mean, like that could go back into your toolbox as something that you're using as part of your argument for the reportage model of the Gospels. But I don't think it's going to be a substitute for that. See, if the gospel, I think people don't realize what granting for the sake of the argument really is. It's really strong. I have a technical article out there called Be Careful What You Grant. I started it with New Testament studies in mind, and I ended up writing it using intelligent design as the example. It was kind of funny. I was like, but the meta level point is the same. Um, when you grant something, even for the sake of the argument, then that is an umbrella over your entire argument. For the duration of the time or the duration of the argumentative space for which you're granting that, that's over here, what we call to the right of the solidus. Solidus is that up and down line. All right, that's being treated as having probability 1. All right, so we're going to take Gospels are unreliable. We're going to put it over here to the right of the solidus. It has probability 1. Now, that's going to condition all of what you can do and what you can't do. And if that's the case, the resurrection accounts are prime territory. There's a reason that you're never going to find a scholar who thinks the Gospels are unreliable, but the resurrection accounts are reliable. It's, those are where just boom, the criticism goes because they're supposedly full of contradictions. The touch me and see that I am not a ghost is supposedly motivated by trying to give an alternative to docetism, blah, 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 blah. So that's something that once you grant that they are unreliable, you've got a real problem arguing even that this is what the disciples claimed, because the unreliability that you've granted is just going to it's going to block that. Okay. Now, even multiple attestation, which is a criterion, is not going to help once you've granted for the sake of the argument that they are unreliable. People think that multiple attestation is something that is just like super clear to apply. You could just go boom, boom, boom. Look at these. The scholars agree that John is independent of the synoptics, so now we've got independence, and there you go. It doesn't quite work that way. As I've often put it, independent embellishment is the wrong kind of independence. Okay, if we have a fundamental story that Robin Hood existed, all right, and that there was something about him, being good with a bow and arrow, all right, and then we have multiple stories that are taking that and running with it, and they're making up. One of them's making up a story where he's in a contest and he splits, the arrow, and maybe another one is making up a story where, I don't know, he kills the Sheriff of Nottingham with an arrow, etc. I don't know if the latter actually exists, but it's an example. All right, those are independent, but in the sense that they're independent embellishments, they're independently invented. What you need for multiple attestation is independent access to the facts that actually occurred. And your critical scholar, when he says or thinks that the Gospels are not holistically reliable, all right, he's got this whole idea back here that the Gospels were independently embellished. I mean, Dale Allison is another really good example. I made some notes about this. Dr. Craig has said, oh, wow, Dale Allison acknowledges the group appearance. We need to talk about that. That's so wonderful. Like he's made all these recent comments, about how instead of emphasizing the negatives, we should be emphasizing the positives related to Dale Allison. Well, I've dug into that. Dale Allison thinks that you have the appearance in Galilee, which is different from the appearance in Jerusalem, that those weren't really different experiences at all. That they're embellishments on a common core, right? Well, at that point, it's not multiple attestation in the relevant sense. That's multiple embellishment. Or he thinks that both John and Luke had the same motive, had a similar motive. And then he says, for example, the thing to Thomas, touch me and see, etc. Well, that looks defensive. He uses the phrase that it looks defensive. So, okay. So what's common to John and Luke is that they have this motive, this, argumentative, theological, apologetical motive. That's why they include what they include. So you're not going to be able to catch him by saying, look, this is how you have to use the criteria of authenticity. This is how you have to use multiple attestation. So you should admit that they had a group experience of this kind where Jesus actually ate before them and so forth. He's like, no, I've already taken care of that. And what unifies those is the theological motive. Or what unifies those is that maybe he'll suggest that some people had individual experiences that were more robust, and those got transferred over to the group experiences or something like that. So you can't force uh, you because the criteria of authenticity were actually invented within the context of the quest for the historical Jesus, where it was assumed that these are unreliable documents, and then we're trying to mine out nuggets of information, you can't actually force those to yield what you need for the bodily resurrection, and so that they're no substitute for a stronger reliability argument.
Okay. I'm sort of curious. Do you think that if a proponent of a minimal or moderate facts approach, maybe they said, well, okay, look, I made a mistake. I misspoke. I'm not granting. So there is no that conditional, given their thing. But I'm just saying, and I think this is true to what Gary Habermas and Michael Cohen would say is like, look, regardless of what's true, let's say the gospels are inerrant or they're reliable or they're unreliable, regardless, the criteria can be used to pick out certain facts kind of thing. And so as long as they don't make this given, let's not assume that the gospels are in fact unreliable. Could they avoid some of those constraints? And I'll let you answer that, and then I have a question on the multiple independent attestation as well.
Well, I just want to say here, I need to say here that they've actually said things that if we hold them to what they say, they are insisting that their argument works even if you grant that. There are videos, I can give you a video in which Dr. Habermas says, even if these are unreliable, like he's like very insistent, very explicit. And as you know, I don't believe in reinterpreting what people say to make them say something more defensible. I'm sorry, he said it. It's there. It's also in Dr. Craig's the third edition of Reasonable Faith. The little introduction at the beginning of that, he says something like that the Christian apologist should not be saddled. That's his word. He used the word saddled with arguing that the Gospels are reliable, because even if they're unreliable, you can still get facts, truth out of them. See chapter 8 for how this can work. Okay. I think it's chapter 8. And so he's pretty clear there. If they want to back up now and say, I was wrong to say that, they should just admit that they were wrong. They shouldn't say, oh, sorry, that wasn't what I really meant. I'm like, you were pretty darned emphatic about it. That,
Oh, I see.
you need to be held to what you said. Okay, so there's that. All right. But now let's suppose that someone says, all right, I'm not doing that. I disagree with what they said. I disagree with that. We can't actually grant, like somebody agrees with me. We can't actually grant that the Gospels are unreliable. We're just sort of not talking about this right now, or something like that. Then there might be something that you could do, but I think it would need to be an auxiliary part of a maximal data case in order to get a really strong argument. So here's what I've done. I believe I did this when I was on your show with David Campbell Cook, if I recall correctly.
Yep.
So this is I would see this not as an alternative to max data, but as a part of max data. Okay. So as part of the larger maximalist argument, you would say, how did all the true accounts of what their experiences were like disappear and get replaced with these false accounts of what they experienced? All right, because if someone is right, be it Allison or David Campbell Cook or whoever, these critics are right, then what they experienced was something more like if they're in a group. I spelled this out earlier, maybe without the, feet off the floor, but Jesus appears only very briefly. he speaks only very briefly. Maybe he looks visually solid to them, but they don't all go and like try to touch him. The women don't grasp his feet like in Matthew. None of that happened. Um, you know, okay, so they really experienced something quite different from what we have. And that really was what happened. And a true account would have described it that way. But all those true accounts have gone poof. They're gone. They've disappeared. And what we have instead are, let's say it, false accounts of what happened. Even I would say lies, because if Luke or somebody knew that this isn't what happened and he put it in on purpose to try to convince people, that I would say that's a lie. And then to argue that development, usually there's sort of a gesture in the direction, well, development can go in multiple different directions. For example, something could develop in the direction of a more and more elaborate exaltation claim. You could have a development of the vision of Stephen as he's being stoned, right? I could imagine this in an apocryphal gospel. I don't know if it is, but and the heavens were opened and the angels surrounded Jesus and he rode on the clouds and he sat down on a throne at the right hand of the Father, and a scepter was put into his hand. I was just, right. All right. That's an embellishment. That's a development. That could be a development, but it's not in a bodily direction. Why this direction of he's walking around, he can eat, he can talk with them. Why did it have to develop just that way? It could have developed other ways. So that is like this I would call it a very distant cousin of a moderate facts. And that can carry a place, that can have a place within a maximal data. If you just took that all by itself, I don't think it's going to carry the day. I don't think it's going to be enough to overcome a low prior probability for a bodily resurrection. Because for one thing, the person can push the other way. He can say, okay, you said you weren't saying anything about the reliability of the Gospels. You were setting that aside for the moment, just not talking about it. Okay, now let's talk about it. Right? And he comes in and he says, now let's talk about it. And the way he argues, let's say, is, look, it's obvious that these are embellished. These definitely are embellished. And therefore, probably this isn't how it happened. These experiences weren't like that. Because if they really were like that, then they wouldn't have needed to embellish. They could just record the actual experiences, right? So he's like arguing the opposite way. He's arguing that they were embellished, therefore they probably didn't have experiences of this kind. Now, what have we done? We've put off the argument about gospel reliability for 10 minutes. Okay, we got to confront it in the end anyway, because he's going to use the supposed unreliability of the gospels and specifically of the resurrection narratives against the bodily resurrection. So all you're doing is, putting off the evil day when you have to actually go full maximalist.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right. So, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip, but there is one major topic or aspect to a minimal and or possibly to a moderate facts approach that we haven't even addressed in this. And there is this issue with the minimal and moderate facts approach. There's the scholarly consensus criterion, and I'm just sort of curious. What's your take? The maximal facts approach doesn't need to rely on scholarly consensus, whereas minimal facts. Do you think there are any problems with the scholarly consensus criterion itself?
Oh, there are huge problems. Absolutely huge problems. The fact of the matter is, you can't get blood from a stone. You can't turn lead into gold. As I survey these things, I do not believe, I believe contrary. There is not a scholarly consensus in favor of the premises that you actually need for a strong resurrection argument. Therefore, if you consistently apply a scholarly consensus criterion, you are going to lose. And you're going to lose because your argument deserves to lose because the argument is at that point fatally weakened because you've insisted on relying and you've been consistent with it. Like, you don't do a bait and switch. You don't say, I'm going to only rely on scholarly consensus granted things and then, oh, but now I'm going to bring in this other thing. Wait a minute, that's not granted by the scholarly consensus. Let's say you're consistent with it. It's going to be too weak. So that's why there is actually a big problem with that. And I think we run into this in a case where we're in danger of almost misleading people. I am hugely opposed to the use of these alleged money quotes. Like, I don't have it memorized, but that Gerd Ludemann quote, everybody loves that Gerd Ludemann quote. It may be something like, it may be taken as certain that the disciples had experiences which they believed were experiences of the risen Jesus. I'm not getting it exact, but you know what I'm talking about. And it's like, Gerd Ludemann is an atheist or whatever, and even he said this, right? And it's like out there, it's a meme. You put it in the middle of a box and you post it on Twitter and all of that. And then you delve down into it and you find out Gerd Ludemann says the original seeing was a seeing in the spirit and all the physical details were added later. Oh, not those kinds of experiences. So now you've promoted this as if it's a big deal. And it's not really that big of a deal because when you find out what it really means, it's nothing to write home about. So I think we tempt ourselves to do that when we take a minimalist approach, to be, whether intentionally or unintentionally, misleading about what people really grant, what people really think, whether it be the whole consensus of scholarship or whether it be one particular scholar like Ludemann or Allison. We're sort of like covering over the very strong disagreements and the true unexcitingness of what they actually grant, making it sound more exciting than it is. So yeah, there's many problems with the scholarly consensus criterion.
Okay, well, I'm kind of curious. So those are sort of problems on a factual issue, but let's say we're talking 100 years from now, and guess what? Majority of scholars do agree with the specific facts needed that are sufficient to argue for a bodily resurrection and stuff like that. Number one, do you think that if the circumstances change, would that change the nature of the need? Okay, I'm going to ask a different question. Sorry. So here's what I think we might disagree on this. So in terms of the scholarly consensus criterion, if we fix some of the problematic issues as to how it's applied today or something, let's forget those. Do you think it could be a sufficient criterion for being warranted in believing, yeah, these are probably facts? Because I think under the proper conditions, if we have a proper scholarly consensus, not one based on bias or provable problems like political pressure or something like that, I do think it can warrant. It's a very weak form of warrant, but it's sufficient on a balance of probabilities. So if a minimal facts person says, look, scholarly consensus is not a necessary criterion, let's throw that out. But it can be used as a sufficient criterion to argue, yeah, we're warranted in believing in these facts. Do you think that could work if it's a proper scholarly consensus?
Well, I want to go for your if clause. I want to talk about your if clause. How does the person who's using it or the person who's hearing it used know that it's a proper consensus? Okay, I'm an epistemologist. I'm always asking, how do you know? All right. So it's a proxy, right? You're treating it as a proxy for knowing arguments. All right. You're saying, well, if these people all agree with this and they disagree about other things, then they agree with this, then it's probably true. I know that proxy fails. That proxy fails a lot. I'm going to give you an example right here from New Testament scholarship, New Testament studies. I can find you scholars, quote unquote, across the spectrum, at least into the ranks of evangelical labeled scholars, not Norm Geisler, maybe, not that person, but evangelicals, scholars who are at least thought to be conservative, and then all the way over to the most liberal who think John or whoever was the author of the fourth gospel sometimes made stuff up that didn't happen. We got a consensus on that. We have a scholarly consensus. And moreover, it's a varied scholarly consensus. You've got liberals, moderates, complete skeptics, liberals, moderates, and so-called conservatives. I mean, unless you say that automatically disqualifies them from being a conservative, which a lot of pastors and men in the pew probably would say, but at least that from a kind of a view of a person who's not deeply embedded in the discipline would call them conservatives, and they all agree with that. They may not agree on the whole list of the things that John changed or added or made up, although I could probably find common ground in the temple cleansing. Highly diverse consensus that John dischronologically moved the temple cleansing. And I think they're wrong. It fails. Okay, so this is why I don't consider it a sufficient condition. And I even have theories of my own as to how that supposedly diverse consensus ends up being not as diverse as it appears to be. I would say it's not a proper consensus, but why? Because the arguments stink. The arguments for that proposition are terrible. But how did I find that out? I had to go look at the arguments, and now you're a maximalist again. Okay. Now you're doing maximalism again in order to discover whether that supposedly diverse consensus is a so-called proper consensus or whether it's a misleading consensus. So that's why I would say no, it can't be a sufficient condition.
All right, fair enough, fair enough. All right, so just want to end off a couple quick questions for you. So the first one is there any argument that's broadly non-maximalist, right? So either minimal or moderate, that you think does have any force in favor of the resurrection? And if so, how much?
I would put in place that one that I called a distant cousin, that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. And then I would see that only as a part of a larger maximalist argument. To say how much force it has if you just do that part of it, it's a good question. And sometimes we're just making up illustrative numbers. So at an illustrative number, if you just gave that argument, hey, where did all the true accounts of what happened disappear to? And, why do we have only false accounts, according to you, Mr. Disbeliever in the bodily resurrection? Why are all the ones we have false? And development, sorry, that's not gonna swing it all by itself because it could have developed in more than one way. That's got some force as part of that total maximalist cumulative case. And what could we put that at? 3-1? 2-1, something like that. It's got force. As long as you don't grant this other stuff for the sake of the argument, as long as you realize you're only putting off the argument about reliability, as I said there, you're not kind of doing an end run around it, because we're asking people to be willing to die. Okay, and so this is where what we might call decision theory is over here, and probability theory is over here. All right, decision theory has to do with, okay, if I think that bridge is strong, and I'm going to go out there, I'm going to walk across it, and if it breaks, I'm going to fall to my death. Okay, how strong is my evidence that that bridge is strong? Right? All right, you've got your decision theory where you decide to walk across, and then that's going to be intertwined with your probability theory. Ultimately, I believe a person, in order to be a Christian, needs to have a very high posterior probability, a justified, okay, rational, very high posterior probability on the basis of all evidence that Christianity is true and that Jesus rose again. Because we're very comfortable here in our Western countries, but we know that there are people who aren't so comfortable and they are being asked to die, and it could happen to any of us. Okay. And 3-1 ain't gonna cut it because we should admit that miracles don't happen. Well, I'm not a Pentecostal. I'm not a continuationist. Miracles don't happen every single day. Miracles are signs. In fact, in other words, for them to be signs, they need to be somewhat improbable. If they happened every day, they wouldn't be all that impressive. Um, and so therefore, if you have a legitimate kind of skepticism, then you need strong evidence to overcome that kind of skepticism. And so that's why even that distant cousin, it's only part of a wider argument so that you're ready to go deeper, right? You're not writing everything just on that.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay. All right. And can you address briefly? Okay. So yeah, I've actually have a fan, Justin. So there is a criticism of the maximal facts approach. Look, the whole point of the minimal and moderate facts is it helps. It's more efficient. It helps us save time when we're dealing with a skeptic in the moment and stuff. Whereas a maximalist facts approach is very cumbersome, right? You have to go through all these steps of the three-part step of establishing DT, establishing that the DT is reliable, and all this stuff. You have to establish this reportage model, and that's quite detailed and involved. So how do you kind of respond to the objection that using the max facts approach, it's just too cumbersome to be realistic?
Right. Well, I've got two approaches, one theoretical, two responses, one theoretical, one practical. The theoretical response is too bad, Buttercup. If we've got, you know, if I'm right about this, you cannot, without being misleading, make a strong argument in the minimalist way. So we don't have a choice. If we're honest, we got to go with something that actually is a strong argument, not try to pretty up and make claims that something is a strong argument when it isn't really a strong argument. So that's my theoretical response. My practical response, however, is that I can give you a 2-minute version, a 10-minute version, and a 30-minute version of a max data. And 30 minutes it's in the zone for an opening statement or something like that. I have a thing I did for the Areopagus Forum, I think in 2022, that's out there is 35 minutes. And I recently did another one where I forget. I think I let myself have 40 minutes that time. But so any argument you make for the resurrection, it's going to scale. It's going to scale up or it's going to scale down. The same is true of the minimal facts. Michael Licona did a 7-hour debate with Bart Ehrman. And let me also point out, Bart Ehrman doesn't grant group appearances. He doesn't. He says maybe they happened, maybe they didn't. And if they did, they were like seeing at a distance. Okay. So, and he's somebody people want to be able to debate. Do your fans want to be able to debate a Bart Ehrman clone? Well, probably, right? Well, I got news for you. He is not going to grant one of the most prominent moderate or minimal facts. So now what are you going to do? Okay. So that's going to, it's going to scale up or scale down if it's a minimal facts thing, depending on what your interlocutor allows, what he doesn't allow, etc. And the same for a max data. It's going to scale up or it's going to scale down depending on how much time you have, depending on whether you're talking to a specific interlocutor, you're dealing with his specific objections and what those might be. So it really is not true that this is automatically like super cumbersome. You could never use it in a debate. You absolutely could use it in a debate. It's just that, as in the minimal facts argument, frankly, you have your pots and pans and you cook the meal and you leave your pots and pans in the kitchen and you bring the food to the table. All right. So your minimal facts person might get challenged, and you and I have gone back and forth on this. Is this really granted by a large majority? Hey, did this person, might be Gary Habermas, did he really show that? Somebody might challenge that. They might challenge the statistical claim that this is granted. And now okay, do you have those pots and pans back in the kitchen? You're a minimal facts person, so that you can bring that out. You can answer that claim, right? That your skeptic claims, hey, Dr. Habermas was mistaken. This isn't granted by a very large majority, or whatever, or he misinterpreted somebody, or whatever. You gotta have your preparation for that. And that's going to get you into some pretty deep weeds over here, if that's a challenge that's made to you. So I think there's a lot more parity, practically speaking, between the two approaches than is generally granted. And so it's kind of facile to just say, I want something easy. I want something quick. I'm, and we need to have something quick. We need something, that you won't get laughed at where you're using your I've seen Dr. Habermas do that. If you start relying on the Gospel of John, they're going to laugh you off the stage. I believe that was his statement, or laugh you out of court or something. So I want to start with premises I'm not going to get laughed at. Well, good luck with that, because I think a canny interlocutor can force you to spend lots of time, even though you're taking a minimalist approach. And on the other hand, I have a better way for you to go, which is both really argumentatively strong and also subject to fairly efficient presentation at various levels of detail.
All right, awesome. So I do see, we are at the hour and a half mark, but I just want to ask you last question. Is there anything that I missed or I didn't ask you about that you think is really important with respect to this minimal versus maximal facts approach, issue kind of thing?
I think we've hit the highlights. I think we've hit the biggies, and I would really encourage people to, maybe read my book, Testimonies to the Truth, which isn't even about the resurrection alone. I mean, it has a chapter on the resurrection accounts, but get a sense of the accessibility of this and start just kind of opening your mind to the maximalist approach to the Gospels, the reportage approach to the Gospels, and the maximalist approach to the argument, rather than relying on really brief dismissals or something like that. Those might be, we shouldn't disagree about this. We're all Christians. We shouldn't have disagreements. That's one. Or, it takes too long. That's another one. Or, no, I really think scholarly consensus is important. That's another one, and you just have these various things and you kind of brush it off. I would really urge people not to brush it off. If you're interested in defending the Christian faith, which I assume a lot of people are, dive into this. And if someone is a skeptic, he's not a Christian, look into this, look into what these resources are, and don't rely lazily on, scholarly consensus disagrees with Lydia McGrew, so I don't have to listen to Lydia McGrew. I mean, I think you could do better than that, whether you're a skeptic or a Christian.
Absolutely. All right. Awesome. Well, that means I did a good job as the host, because I managed to fit everything in. So yeah, that's great. I just want to say thank you so much for coming on, because I fully agree with you. Look, it's healthy and it's good for us as Christians. We're going to disagree at times. I disagree with some of the things that Lydia said today, but I agree with a lot of the things she said as well. But it's good for us to come together as Christians, as brother and sister, and work things out. We're trying to get to God's truth at the end of the day. So I fully concur with your final statement there. And that's should be it for today. Just so the audience knows, next week I am having Jack Markwart will be coming on to speak on Lydia's favorite subject, the Shroud of Turin. But he's coming on to speak about the Shroud.
That was a joke.
I was sarcastic, yeah. But he'll be covering the history of the Shroud from the medieval period, so 1204 to 1355. And as my fans will know, there's about 17 different historical hypotheses just covering this period. So tune into that next week, and we'll be doing a detailed presentation on that. But otherwise, take care and God bless everybody. And before you go, I've got a little bit of a bonus here for you guys from Harry Stark and Harry Stark Productions. Here's a short 2-minute clip, or 2 to 3 minute clip, on the topic of John Chrysostom. Was that early church father a racist pig or not?
Even if you look at John Chrysostom, like, his issue is not with Jews being Jews, it's with Christians fetishizing Jewish traditions. It's with Judaizers who are bringing that into the church and saying it's better, right? And he has issues with the Jews that are influencing that and trying to do that. It's not because people are Jews. Like there's important distinctions to make, right? It's not, and remember that it was also Jews were persecuting the early Christians in Israel, and then also under the Sassanid Empire in Persia, Babylonia, were killing Christians by the thousands alongside the leadership there. So you could very easily make the claim that Christians are the most persecuted demographic in history. I told somebody the other day, like St. John Chrysostom has been following me around. Like I'll be going to read something else and I'll end up reading Chrysostom. It's just, and then suddenly there'll be an icon of him somewhere. So just ended up reading a lot of Chrysostom. As far as favorite saints of the church, first of all is St. John Chrysostom, which is very funny for some people that I say that.
Yeah, I know why.
But I think people misunderstand his writings and what he's talking. He's harsh on the Jewish people, but that's not the reason why. It's not the Jews that are the problem. It's people that are desperate to lick the feet of rabbis at the synagogue that he's concerned with. The reason, though, is not so much about that. It's that I spoke to the guy that I study with for my catechesis. He's a seminarian, and he said it sounds like he's one of those when there's like a saint that they start following you everywhere. Like sometimes you'll initiate the relationship with a saint because it speaks to you and you want to. So
right.
Sometimes there's a saint that starts following you around. So that's what it's like for me with St. John Chrysostom. Everywhere I go, there's an icon of him. Everywhere that I'm searching, there's an icon of him.
Right.
Everywhere I'm reading a church father, suddenly there's like a link to something from John Chrysostom. Like it's just, he's everywhere for me. Like he's on me everywhere nonstop. It was brought to me by somebody that I study with from my church. He said, he was telling me, there's like sometimes people like certain saints, and then there's sometimes that there's a saint that just starts to make a relationship with you and starts to follow you around. For me, that's St. John Chrysostom. Not to say that he's my favorite saint, but I feel like everywhere I go, he's there, trying to tell me something. So icons of him popping up randomest places when I'm not looking for it. I'm reading some other church father and he pops up. So that's St. John Chrysostom.